"I don't need a bookkeeper," the man said, wiping grease off his knuckles without looking up. "I need a wife." The garage went dead silent. Somewhere behind him, a wrench clattered to the concrete floor. Mara Ellison almost walked out right then. She would have, if she hadn't noticed the small drawing taped above his workbench, a crayon sketch of a house, a truck, and 3 stick figures, one of them crossed out in pencil, like someone had tried to erase a person who was already gone. 6 weeks from now, Wyatt Calloway would stand in front of the entire town and admit he'd been wrong about almost everything. But on this particular gray Tuesday, he didn't even know her name yet. Stay with me to the end of this one. It's worth it. And if stories like this one find you when you need them, hit subscribe. Velvet Storiez Tales has a lot more waiting for you. Mara hadn't planned on Millbrook Falls. She'd planned on nothing, really, not since the termination letter had arrived 8 months earlier with a severance check too small to cover what she'd lost. She'd driven until her savings told her to stop, and her savings told her to stop in a town with 1 stoplight, 1 diner, and a hand-painted sign reading Calloway and Son Auto Repair, though anyone who asked around quickly learned there was no son. There was a daughter, Josie, 9 years old, who spent most afternoons doing homework on an overturned tire in the corner of the shop because there was nowhere else for her to be. Mara took a room above the hardware store for $200 a month and started walking past the garage every morning on her way to nowhere in particular. She'd been a quality assurance director once, 13 years climbing the ladder at Ferris Grant Automotive Supply, responsible for the safety testing on parts that went into half the vehicles in 3 states. She'd been good at it. Careful. The kind of careful that eventually got her fired, because careful people ask questions that comfortable people don't want answered. She'd found the discrepancy herself, a batch of steering components that had failed internal stress tests twice, shipped anyway under a supervisor's signature that wasn't his own. She reported it up the chain the way she'd been trained to. Compliance went quiet. Legal went quiet. 3 months later her position was eliminated in a restructuring, and somehow every position beneath her survived intact. She never got another interview in the industry again. She stopped wondering why after the 9th rejection. So when she saw the faded help wanted sign taped inside Calloway and Son's window, pride was a luxury she'd already spent. Wyatt Calloway was exactly what the town had described, quiet to the point of rudeness, a man who measured his words the way he measured torque specs. He didn't ask her to sit. He asked if she could rebuild a carburetor. She said no. He asked if she'd ever changed her own oil. She said no again, and this time she almost smiled at how absurd the question was for a job posting that said nothing about mechanical experience. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked if she could keep books. Manage invoices. Chase down customers who owed money and hadn't paid in months. That, she said, she could do. Something in her voice made him look at her properly for the first time, not through her, the way most people in this town had learned to do with strangers who didn't explain themselves. Still, he shook his head. Every dollar this shop made went straight back into staying open. He couldn't justify another paycheck. She turned to leave. That's when he said it, the line that would follow her around town for weeks after, told and retold with varying degrees of scandal. "I don't need a bookkeeper. I need a wife." He didn't say it as a joke. There was no smirk, no charm behind it, only the flat exhaustion of a man who'd said the true thing by accident and was too tired to take it back. Josie, folding laundry on the tire in the corner, didn't even look up. She'd apparently heard some version of this before. Mara's eyes drifted to the drawing taped above the workbench, and then to the plain gold band hanging from a nail beside it, dulled with 3 years of dust and motor oil. She understood, without being told anything, that she'd walked into something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with grief that hadn't finished healing. She didn't ask about it. She said she understood, and she left. She came back the next morning anyway, not for the job, but because she'd noticed the shop's front step was cracked badly enough to trip someone, and it felt wrong to know that and say nothing. Wyatt, startled to see her again, poured 2 cups of burnt coffee out of pure Montana reflex, the kind of courtesy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with manners. Josie parked herself on the 3rd chair without asking permission and studied Mara with the unfiltered curiosity only a 9-year-old can get away with. "Are you the wife he needs?" Josie asked, swinging her legs. "Josephine." Wyatt's voice carried the particular weariness of a father who had stopped being surprised by his daughter's directness years ago. "He says that to everybody who asks about the job," Josie told Mara, matter of fact. "The Rodriguez lady. The man from the tire place. He said it to the mailman once." "I did not say it to the mailman." "You said something like it." Mara laughed before she could stop herself, and something in Wyatt's shoulders loosened at the sound, like he hadn't heard real laughter in that garage for longer than he wanted to admit. Josie, satisfied she'd made her point, went back to swinging her legs against the tire and announced, without looking up, that her mother used to bring lunch to the shop every day at noon and hum while she waited, and that her dad still went quiet whenever those same 3 songs came on the radio. She said it the way children say the truest things, plainly, without any sense that it might land heavier on the adults in the room than it did on her. Wyatt didn't correct her. He just looked down at the coffee in his hands like it had suddenly gotten very interesting, and Mara understood, without needing anyone to explain it further, exactly what kind of silence she'd walked into that first day. She didn't push. She asked Josie instead about school, about the drawing taped over the workbench, and let the girl talk until the weight in the room lifted on its own, the way weight sometimes does when nobody insists on carrying it alone. Over the following days, without asking for a title or a wage, Mara let herself into the shop each morning through the propped side door and started fixing what nobody had asked her to fix. She found 4 years of invoices stuffed into a filing cabinet with no order to them at all. She matched receipts to bank statements late into the evenings after Wyatt had taken Josie home. She called customers whose service reminders had been ignored for months, apologizing on the shop's behalf, rebooking appointments that had quietly evaporated into the chaos of a man raising a daughter alone while running a business alone, because grief doesn't leave room for filing systems. Wyatt tested her once, left a tangled stack of unpaid invoices on the counter overnight to see whether she'd sort them or simply work around the mess the way everyone eventually did. She had them organized by the time he arrived. He never mentioned the test again. By the 3rd week, the phone rang more than it had all year. 2 customers who drifted to the Doyle Auto Group location across the county line came back, saying the shop finally felt like someone was minding it. Mara negotiated better rates with 2 of the parts suppliers and found enough savings in a month to cover what would have been her own wages twice over, a fact she mentioned to Wyatt with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd rather show him than tell him. He refused to pay her for 3 weeks. "I don't want to owe anybody anything," he told her flatly, and she understood by then that the refusal wasn't about money, it was about a man who'd built armor out of not needing people, because the last time he'd needed someone, he'd lost her. It was Ruth Alvarez, who ran the credit union on Main Street and had known the Calloway family for 30 years, who finally talked sense into him, mentioning, almost in passing, that the shop's deposits had visibly improved. Wyatt relented, backdated Mara's pay to her first day, and made her promise never to bring it up again. Marcus Doyle showed up 2 weeks later, driving a truck too clean for a man who claimed he still turned wrenches himself. He ran 4 Doyle Auto Group locations across the region, with a 5th under construction, and he'd built every one of them the same way, buying out small independent shops the moment they showed the first signs of strain. He walked through Calloway & Son like he already owned it, ran a finger along the workbench, and laid a folded contract on the counter as if the matter only needed a signature. Wyatt refused before Doyle finished his pitch. Doyle smiled the way men do when rejection is unfamiliar to them, folded the contract back into his jacket, and said Wyatt would be out of business within 6 months whether he signed today or not. Then he left without a wave. Within days, things started going wrong in a way that felt too coordinated to be bad luck. A parts supplier of a decade suddenly canceled the account, citing vague changes in policy. A shipment of brake components vanished between warehouse and shop, stalling 3 repairs for a week. 2 more customers mentioned, almost apologetically, that a shop across the county line was offering half-price service. A shop Mara discovered, after cross-referencing business filings late one night, was Doyle's chain operating under a different name. Wyatt wanted to believe it was misfortune. Mara had learned the hard way that misfortune doesn't usually arrive on schedule. She started a notebook, dates, cancellations, timing, a habit left over from a career where she'd once tracked something far more dangerous than a rival's pride. Then the letter came from the bank threatening foreclosure over a payment neither of them remembered missing, and even Wyatt stopped calling it coincidence. Mara spent that whole night going through boxes of records untouched for years, the office growing colder as the space heater rattled weakly in the corner. Around midnight she found the first error, a payment recorded twice under two different names. From there, the tangle unraveled. Not fraud, exactly. Just the quiet chaos that accumulates when a grieving man tries to run a business, raise a daughter, and keep himself upright, all with the same two exhausted hands. She found forgotten invoices worth thousands. A tax refund from 3 years back that had never been claimed because the paperwork was buried under receipts. By sunrise, she had enough documentation to answer the bank's letter with facts instead of apologies. Buried beneath a decade of unopened parts catalogs, Mara also found something that had nothing to do with the bank. A plain envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in careful handwriting to "Whoever keeps this place honest." Inside was a letter from Walter Calloway, Wyatt's father, written the winter before he died, long before Mara had ever set foot in Millbrook Falls. The letter wasn't a will. It wasn't legal, not really. It was just an old man's private wish, tucked away where he must have known his son would eventually find it, or someone his son trusted would. Walter wrote that he'd built the shop on the idea that a business survives on the character of whoever runs it, not on family names painted over a door. He'd left instructions with Ruth Alvarez years earlier, quietly, that if the shop ever needed saving, it should be saved by whoever showed up and did the honest work, blood or not. He hadn't known who that would be. He'd only hoped his son would recognize the person when they arrived, and not be too stubborn or too grieving to let them stay. Mara read it twice before she understood her hands were shaking. She almost didn't show Wyatt at all, worried it would reopen a wound rather than close one. But she thought of every door that had shut on her without explanation over the past 2 years, and decided Wyatt deserved better than a closed door from her, too. He read it standing in the same doorway where she'd found him that first morning, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Then he folded the letter carefully, the way a man handles something he intends to keep for the rest of his life, and looked at the stacks of paper Mara had spent all night organizing. He always did like being right about people before they knew it themselves, Wyatt said finally, and something in his voice cracked just slightly, in a way Mara understood better than she could have explained. He set the letter on the workbench, beside the ring on its wrench, as if it belonged there now too. "Thank you," he told her, the words rough, like gratitude was a language he hadn't practiced in years. Ruth Alvarez extended the loan by 6 months without penalty, on the condition the shop kept submitting quarterly statements to the same standard. Mara agreed before Wyatt had fully processed what had happened. That should have ended it. Doyle didn't let it. Having failed to buy the shop and failed to starve it out, he turned to something uglier, quietly suggesting around town that the woman keeping Calloway and Sons books wasn't who she claimed to be, that she'd left her last job under circumstances nobody could quite explain. He didn't need to finish the insinuation. Small towns finish sentences on their own. Wyatt heard it secondhand from a customer and asked her directly. Mara didn't flinch, though her hands tightened around her coffee mug before she set it down. She told him everything, the failed steering components, the falsified signature, the reports she'd filed up every proper channel until the company buried them and quietly maneuvered her out within the year. 18 months of jobs that never called back. A name flagged in conversations she was never part of. Her savings gone, her furniture sold, until she was standing in a small Montana garage asking a stranger for work she was barely qualified to do. "I did the right thing," she said, "and it cost me everything. I understand if that changes things." Wyatt was quiet long enough that she braced for the rejection. Then he set down the wrench he'd been turning over and looked at her the way he rarely looked at anything that wasn't an engine. "I trust you," he said, with the same plain certainty he used diagnosing a dead alternator. "In my experience, the people most eager to point fingers usually have something to hide themselves." It was, she'd think later, one of the most healing sentences anyone had said to her in 2 years, delivered without ceremony, by a man who had no idea how much weight it carried. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of them named but both understood. Mara started staying later than the work required. Wyatt started asking her opinion on things he used to decide alone. Josie started leaving a second sandwich in her lunchbox, in case Mara forgets hers, which Mara never did, but she ate it anyway every time. One evening a storm knocked out power across half the county, and the three of them sat in the office by lantern light waiting it out, because nobody particularly wanted to drive home on the ice. Josie fell asleep on the shop's old couch halfway through. Wyatt told Mara, in the quiet way men sometimes only manage in darkness, that he'd meant what he said her first day, more than either of them had understood at the time. "I said I needed a wife," he told her. "I still think that's true. Not because I need someone to cook or manage what I can't. I need someone who chooses to be here anyway. Every day. The way you already have." There was no ring, no rehearsed speech. Just 2 chairs pulled close in a cold garage, a sleeping 9-year-old on a couch nearby, and a storm rattling the windows. Mara didn't answer right away. She thought of the company that discarded her, the apartments she couldn't afford, the drive into this town with nothing but a trunk full of boxes and no plan. None of it had led her here by design. And yet, somehow, it had. She reached over and took his hand. For both of them, that was answer enough. Doyle's last move came in early spring, sharper than anything before it, falsified documents reaching the state tax authority, alleging years of underreported income. Wyatt called his lawyer, Sam Whitfield, the same afternoon, and an inspector arrived within the week demanding 5 years of records. Records that, thanks to months of Mara's work, existed complete and accurate for the first time in the shop's history. She walked the inspector through every ledger, every reconciled statement, over 3 days, until the inspector admitted she'd rarely seen a small shop's books kept this cleanly. By the 3rd day, the discrepancy at the center of the complaint traced back to a shell account connected, through several careless layers, to one of Doyle's own companies, a routing number Mara herself found while cross-referencing public filings late one night, a mistake sloppy enough to suggest arrogance rather than caution. The findings didn't just clear the shop. They opened a formal investigation into Doyle Auto Group that would eventually cost Marcus Doyle 2 of his 4 locations and considerably more of his reputation than he'd ever managed to cost Wyatt. Customers who drifted away over the winter came back, some out of restored loyalty, some just curious to see the little shop that had outlasted a man 4 times its size. Not long after, Wyatt did something Mara never expected. He sold his truck, the restored classic he'd spent a decade rebuilding piece by piece after closing each night, the one thing he'd always called irreplaceable. She assumed it was a last, desperate sacrifice and nearly said something to stop him before the sale closed. He hadn't sold it to save the business. He'd sold it to buy the small house next to the garage, the one with the sagging porch that Mara had walked past 100 times without a second look. He walked her through it one evening after closing, mostly bare, one bulb hanging from the ceiling, floorboards creaking under their weight. "I didn't buy this because I need a wife to run a household," he said, standing in the empty living room while dust drifted through the last of the evening light. "I bought it because I want someone who leaves a light on for me. Not because she has to. Because she wants to. I think that's you. I've thought that since the day you walked into my garage looking for a job I wasn't willing to give you." Mara, who had spent 2 years being told her integrity made her unemployable, cried in a way she hadn't let herself in a long time, not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being fully seen by someone with nothing left to gain from pretending. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Josie, who had apparently been eavesdropping from the hallway the entire time, poked her head in and asked if this meant she finally got to call her mom, or if Mara was still fine for now. Mara's fine for now, Mara told her, laughing through the tears. We'll figure out the rest. Okay, Josie said, entirely satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Their wedding, when it came, was small enough to fit inside the garage itself, chairs borrowed from the diner, flowers from Ruth Alvarez's own garden arranged in mason jars along the parts counter, Sam Whitfield standing witness alongside customers who'd become something closer to family over the past year. Josie walked the makeshift aisle carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself, entirely unsupervised, and announced to the small crowd that she'd approved of Mara since the sandwich thing, which nobody but Mara understood, and which made her laugh until she had to wipe her own eyes before the vows even started. A year passed the way years do in small towns, quietly, steadily, marked more by seasons than by dates. Callaway & Son became, by most accounts, the most trusted shop in 3 counties, its reputation restored not through advertising but through the stubborn, ordinary consistency of good work honestly done. Mara's name went up on the sign beside Wyatt's. She hired back the mechanic Wyatt had once been forced to let go. The shop, one bay at a time, grew back into something closer to what it had been before grief shrank it down to what one man alone could carry. The old wrench still hangs on its nail above the workbench, the faded gold ring still looped around its handle, untouched by everything that changed around it. A customer passing through town once asked Wyatt, with the easy carelessness of a stranger who didn't know what he was asking, why he'd never taken it down, especially now that he'd remarried. Wyatt looked at it a long moment, the way a man looks at something that has stopped hurting and started simply belonging to his history instead. I'm not taking it down, he said. It reminds me that love doesn't end just because someone leaves. It just teaches you to open your heart a little wider than before. Mara, standing nearby with Josie's homework spread across the counter she was supposedly helping with, walked over and took his hand without a word. Neither of them needed to say anything more about the ring, or the years before it, or the long road that had carried 2 people who'd each rebuilt themselves from very little into the same small garage on opposite sides of hardship. Outside, the frost had finally given way to a pale spring morning, and somewhere down the road a truck engine turned over on the first try, a small, ordinary sound that once might have gone unnoticed, but now felt, to both of them, like a quiet kind of miracle. Josie, older now by a year and considerably more confident in her opinions, poked her head out the office door to remind them both that their first appointment of the day had arrived and was waving through the windshield like he expected somebody to actually notice him. Wyatt told her he'd be right there. He didn't move yet. Neither did Mara. For one more moment they simply stood in the doorway of the shop that had nearly gone under twice, that had buried a wife and a father and years of silence inside its walls, and was somehow, impossibly, still standing, fuller now than it had been in a decade, and louder, and warmer, in all the ways that mattered. Walter Callaway's letter still sat on the workbench where Wyatt had left it, tucked now inside a plain wooden frame Josie had picked out herself from the hardware store, because she said a letter like that deserved better than a drawer. Beside it hung the wrench, and beside the wrench, still, the faded gold ring, 2 histories side by side instead of one erasing the other, exactly the way Wyatt had once told a curious stranger love was supposed to work, if a person let it. Neither of them had been looking for this. It found them anyway, in a cold garage, on a rainy Tuesday, over a sentence that was never meant to be a proposal, and became one regardless. Velvet Storiez Tales.